All right. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today, sponsoring with the World Commerce and Contracting. Today, our webinar topic will be procurement can add value to the business, but have we been listening? We've created a very insightful white paper that has some great insights on the value of procurement and just some measuring of the relative gaps in stakeholder and procurement practitioner perceptions. And we'd love to go over that with you today. So let me introduce our hosts, our panel. Today we have Mike O'Brien. He is the CPO and head of ContractAI at App Orchid. And then we also have Tim Cummins. He is the head of World Commerce and Contracting. I will actually just put up a really quick poll to actually get some feedback from you from a stakeholder's perspective. So let me launch that right now while I get this slide going. Can everyone see the poll? Mike, can you see the poll?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great.
So I think here is what we're trying to get at is, from a stakeholder's perspective, how long does it take to complete an average contract? So as I think of this, think of the time it takes to fly from Houston to San Francisco. It's not the 4 hours of time in the air once the plane takes off. It's more like 8+ hours to drive to the airport, park the car, get through security, board the plane, fly, land, get another taxi, rent a car, drive to the destination. So when you think about that, think about it from kind of a stakeholder's perspective of when they first have the need to, entering their request to the time the supplier is onboarded and they can start doing work.
Yeah, I'm glad everybody is filling that in, Mike. I think I think we can both say that we were really quite excited by the findings from this particular set of research. It threw out probably a few things that surprised both of us, and I loved the angle that App Orchid wanted to take here, really gathering the senior stakeholder views. We often speculate on what we think executives want, but how often do we actually really go and have that conversation and find out? And I think the disconnect that we found in some instances between the assumptions of people in procurement versus the realities of the executive suite, it makes for some thought-provoking and highly informative ideas around ways that procurement can change and in some cases perhaps must change.
Yeah, I think it's really important, to be able to look at through different perspective and different lenses, rather than always looking from, inside of our area, and understand the perceptions and the small things that you can do to impact that and in that continuous cycle of improvement. So, like more views into the perception of the work that you're doing always helps.
Well, in the module, the postgraduate module I'm currently teaching at Leeds University has had a lot of content about mindfulness, where of course it really gets people to step back and undertake more self-assessment of their beliefs, their assumptions, etc. And it is so important, and in a sense, this webinar is in a way about mindfulness, I guess.
That's a good point. I mean, I think it's always important to take time to kind of recenter yourself. You can sometimes just get blinded by the priorities that you've set, which tend to be much more fluid, I think, than anyone would like. But to kind of take time to reset, especially now that we're entering into just about the fourth quarter here and looking to kind of finish strong the rest of the year. Today's probably a good day to kind of recenter and kind of think about it, your position from kind of a stakeholder's view. Kat, how are we doing on the poll?
Oh, let me share the results right now.
Yeah, well, I'd have gone for that 31 to 60. Of course, there's always a bit of a problematical question because I'm sure if we had an option, it depends, we'd probably have 100% giving that answer. And of course, it does depend. Obviously, we have a variety of levels of complexity with the transactions that we undertake. And from our more extensive benchmarks here at WorldCC, I mean, we know that quite a number of procurement groups have managed to get simple procurements down to around a couple of weeks. But then, of course, we've got others where, you know, and certainly from your past life, Mike, I'm sure that you were involved with quite a number where the cycle time could be anything from 6 months to 15 months, because obviously the market is becoming more complicated. And I think for many, there's been a real challenge in the during the COVID world. We've actually seen from the big benchmark we've just done that for the first time in the history of our benchmark studies, which go back now to about 2004, in the period 2019 to 2021, average cycle time has actually for the first time increased. So despite all of our technologies, etc., I guess the challenges of communication, of putting together stakeholder perspectives and views, operating as we were in a remote world, etc., has for many people proved quite challenging.
No, I think that's an interesting perspective. I think, you know, the remoteness that we all work in now definitely does have an impact from, you know, some of the most effective ways is just to get everybody in a room and just hammer it out, right? And then if you want to really reduce the time frame, and the ability to do that right now is difficult, which is I think why you sometimes see that, you know, that time frame becoming more extended, because, you know, just letting everybody now together is difficult. I know ever since the pandemic hit, I think the amount of meetings that I have has probably tripled, right? And the interaction that you have where some of these things get discussed, you know, that those communication points just don't exist anymore, or they're much less frequent. So I think it is poses an interesting dilemma for us, and I think something that, you know, technology can help us solve some of those things. But there's also our human behavior of, you know, trying to carve out time with meetings. You know, I think that needs to change as well. We need to be able to kind of free up some time in our schedule to actually do the work instead of accounting for it, you know, 100% with meetings every day. So maybe let's move on to the next topic and start getting into kind of some of the results of the survey. I think this next area is probably where I found the most interesting. Kind of if you can progress to the next slide. Thanks. So here, I think what's really important here was we talked to both procurement practitioners as well as stakeholders, and we asked what's the highest value procurement brings to the organization. And you can see an interesting kind of divide between the stakeholders and the practitioners. You know, both practitioners saying that cost savings overwhelmingly was the highest value that procurement brings, whereas the stakeholders, you know, they focus more on contribution to revenue growth. And I think that's, you know, you know, for practitioners, that's a kind of a distant fifth, where innovation and contribution and revenue growth is top of mind amongst stakeholders. You know, innovation doesn't even show up on the procurement practitioners things about what they, you know, what's the highest value that they bring to the organization. And I think this information here is just something to kind of think about. So as Tim kind of teed off, like being able to kind of recenter having a view into what the kind of the C-suite is looking for procurement to provide, and then balancing that against, what do you feel is the right value in your organization, or the value that you bring. Having access to something like this is pretty interesting. Tim, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, but I mean, doesn't this data, as a former CPO yourself, Mike, doesn't this sort of data drive you a bit crazy? I mean, we were talking to executives here who have the power, the opportunity to change the metrics that drive the value perception from the practitioner community. I mean, if what we're going to continue doing is focusing on cost saving as the primary measurement, which we know is in fact true for many, many organizations, then don't turn around and tell me that you want innovation and revenue growth. I mean, they don't stack up, do they?
They definitely do not. I mean, I think, for traditionally, we've been measured on cost savings as one of the main metrics, because it's the easiest thing to measure, right? But it's also, I think, creates behaviors that have also kind of created negative connotations to the organization as well. And if the actual want and the need from the stakeholders is innovation and contribution to revenue growth, I think we need to rethink is the way that we look at procurement and the way that we measure procurement's effectiveness. Because what gets measured, that's what gets managed, right? So, and when you look at the stakeholders, it being kind of a distant fifth is cost savings. So there's something to kind of really kind of double click on, and then just understand, are we headed in the right way, or is this really the divide? And is there a need to really change and have that meeting as to, what do you really need from us? And, why are you measuring us on cost savings when actually contribution to revenue growth and innovation is what you're really wanting?
If in fact we are going to respond, well, I think there are two important points here. Firstly, executives often have a fairly distorted view of what procurement, and particularly high value procurement, is about, don't they? Because as executives, they really only have two times when they've got a high level of visibility of procurement. One is if something goes badly wrong. The other one, which hopefully isn't too frequent, the other one is if it's obviously a major item of expenditure. So they don't really have that much sort of visibility to the probably vast majority of the transactions that are being conducted. And so when they start talking about contribution to revenue growth, innovation, they're often talking about a real subset of acquisition activity. Does this tell us that procurement groups need to think perhaps much more about the segmentation of what they're doing, and really start to think much more around better identification of those opportunities where there really is heightened chances of bringing value? Clearly, for example, in new product development, where you may be able to be a very significant factor in revenue growth, particularly if you're combining that with some innovative ideas that create, market advantage, etc. So do we not really segment our portfolio well enough? Is that part of the problem?
I think quite possibly. I think it also is to be able to contribute to revenue growth. I think it requires a further deepening of understanding of how the business actually operates. To be able to contribute to it, you have to get outside of your processes and actually spend time with the stakeholders and understand, how can procurement contribute to revenue growth? I mean, that could manifest itself in a number of different ways. That could be like decrease in the time to market, the obvious, the lower direct costs, but actually understanding the impact through procurement and the influence that procurement has. One example I had was, when I was at BP, we looked at, we're an energy producing company, and the big question was, why were our largest suppliers not our biggest customers as well? And actually, we were able to help foster a deal for alternative energy with Amazon that you kind of see some of the commercials are about. But it was one of those things where procurement can bring parties together. You look at your suppliers as actual possible customers. That doesn't exist for every industry, but looking at different ways and the influence and impact that procurement can have by looking at it from a different perspective, from a different lens. Understanding the flexibility you build into contracts, right? If you understand the business that you're working with, then the commercial constructs that you come up with, to actually give that flexibility to the business to react to maybe a volatile market, to give optionality, to actually spend the time to understand how the business actually grows revenue, and then mirror, those commercial constructs to match that. I mean, that's where you can show significant contribution.
Jason makes a great point in the chat, Mike, saying, I'm really surprised that that supply security essentially isn't top of this list. That obviously the challenges we're reading about every day now. I mean, the 2 or 3 interesting points from that. One, of course, is I suppose sometimes an issue of timing. Of course, we did a lot of this survey work back in the sort of July timeframe, I think, and how quickly things have changed for a lot of industries in terms of the surge of supply chain challenges that we're seeing. It does tend to be somewhat industry specific too as well, doesn't it? We see swirls of problem. Obviously, the media suggests that it's generic, but it tends to be a bit more specific. For some executives, I suppose they might translate that security of supply to that issue of revenue and revenue growth. That obviously, if supply sources are unreliable, there is going to be a knock-on impact to revenue, and it's the revenue and revenue growth on which they, as executives, are going to be measured.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Let's move on to the next topic. So I think there is a misalignment. I think that can be a reality. Practitioners, I think we'd like to be much more strategic. I think from my perspective, I know that I always wanted to be more strategic, but some things took up a significant amount of our time. Cost saving is easiest to measure, obviously, so that's what's focused on. Business risk mitigation is much more difficult to measure than cost savings, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think as we kind of focus on this, the need for our stakeholders to be asking for us to be more strategic, I think that's important. We should probably take that in. But what would we have to change, and what would we have to stop to be more strategic? And I think you have to make a conscious effort to understand, what do you do today, and what would you change, or what would you stop, or what could technology help you eliminate, so that you could focus on these things to actually drive more value for your company. Tim, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I just put up a question in chat, actually. What do you think strategic means in this context? I mean, it's a word that's often bandied around and probably means very different things to different people. To my mind, Mike, the real secret sauce here is the procurement groups that are absolutely focused on interpreting business goals and business strategies and converting those into a procurement strategy. That's why I love things like the statement around revenue growth, for example, because clearly that is strategic. And, if we want to be listened to, if we want to have big influence, we really do need to strongly relate what we're doing in terms of how that is going to help executive management achieve their goals and objectives. I think stuff like keeping the lights on is just the sort of basics. I mean, if you kept the lights on and kept supply coming, you might get the occasional pat on the back in difficult times. But I mean, that's just the playing chips, isn't it? If you can't do that, then why have I got you here? So if we really want to elevate ourselves, and I think there's a recognition in these statements that we have to go beyond base expectations and differentiate ourselves.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's that differentiation and that value that can be derived from that. There's always the table stakes, right? From a large part, we provide kind of a function of, the lights need to be on, but actually where we really start to add value is where we can kind of differentiate that offering to actually, help and aid in that business growth, whatever that may be for that business.
Lacey has an interesting question. I'm not quite sure of the context, that says, what metrics should be used for success in the performance for suppliers? So not quite sure whether that question is meaning, what are the parallel measures that you should see in a sort of contracting sales team? We've got interesting data on that if you want it, Lacey, but I'm taking it more to mean, I suppose, if you're in procurement, what performance measures, Mike, do you think you really should be putting onto your supply base to support, if you like, that more strategic role?
I mean, that could be a pretty wide-ranging answer depending on the industry. So, in some industries, it's really about cost reduction and efficiency. In others, it might be time to market. So I think you have to understand how your business operates, and for that category of or area that you're working within, what are the business goals, and those metrics may be different that you'd want to pass on to your supplier. But I think you have to first understand what the goal of the business is and mirror those commercial constructs and those metrics to the success of the business, not really generic things that I could tell you, we would measure availability, we've measured this, I think you have to really understand what it is for that category of spend that makes the most sense to find what the metrics are. And I would push to, you just have to kind of push past, the cost savings, because that's interesting. But I think we all know that, cost savings can be inflated. A lot of people don't trust that. But does that actually really help in most cases where you get into more indirect spend, does that really help the revenue growth of the company? Probably not. So I think you got to start with the business and then create the metrics to support that. Now, I think the key thing that we always find in metrics is a lot of things are not measurable in a quantitative way and more in a qualitative way. And I think we have to be okay with things that are more qualitative. It doesn't have to be quantitative, because the business and the perception of whether someone's going to buy a good or not, a lot of that's based on qualitative items, not necessarily quantitative. So I think you need to have a balance there. But anything you can tie to actually the success of the business should be passed down. Just like, usually when you start the year, your goals of your CEO gets passed down to each different layer and not diluted, but more focus for that each layer. And I think you have to look at the same thing as running a business. Procurement is part of that running of the business. And just like you receive your things at the beginning of the year, what's important for you, your suppliers should be receiving that same kind of message, and it should be tied to the business as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few interesting examples here. Eric makes the point, and I think it's a very valid one, that the opportunities for that strategic value are in many ways increasing. I mean, Eric makes the point that we need to look for new value drivers beyond savings, and here's the example of sustainability goals. The whole sort of ESG agenda is one obvious field where actually, based at least on our data, there's still a lot of procurement groups who are sort of waiting and saying, well, I know this is important, but not sure what it means to us, waiting for somebody to tell us. And of course, if you really want to be strategic, you don't wait to be told, do you? I think another interesting example of what we're working on at the moment in the pharmaceutical sector, where one of the member groups has come to us and said, look, as a company, as a business, we recognize that the pharma industry is increasingly going to be moving towards outcome-based pricing. So as we flow that through, what does that mean to our procurement relationships? How do we perhaps need to adjust the way we interact and work with suppliers to support that very much more dynamic and risk-based pricing model? So really looking out to the external market and understanding where procurement is going to play in a world that is changing so fast is, I think, both exciting and filled with opportunity.
I think absolutely. Maybe we can move on to the next topic of business risk mitigation. I think one of the things that you and I were talking about, Tim, is, when we say procurement, one of the biggest things that people say in procurement, what do? We manage business risk. What does that actually mean? Because I think we focus so much on the bad things that could happen, protecting us things from the bad things, but we don't really focus on the good things here. And we didn't probably write down all the things in the good area, but I think we need to pivot a little bit to talk about, risk goes both ways, right? If it didn't go both ways, nobody would go to Las Vegas. And so we also need to think about, what are the good things that from a business risk that we're looking at? Like, the market moves in a positive direction. Are we kitted up for that? Do we have, are we able to act upon that? Getting to the market first, allows for contribution, possibly significant revenue growth. Maybe work in something that's is a volatile market. So putting yourself in the place to take benefit from a volatile market position. So kind of looking at when we took a business risk, I think we have to, not only focus on the bad things that can happen, but how do we set our, and this again kind of ties to that theme of contribution to revenue growth. Like, let's protect ourselves from the bad things. But a lot of that we do is kind of tick the box. Do we have this language? Do we have this language? A lot of that stuff is in there. But there's an opportunity here, I think, to focus on the good things. What if this happens? How do we take advantage of that? And I think that's where we can become a little bit more strategic. So I wanted to kind of focus on that a little bit because, Tim and I were talking about this, in preparation and going over the results of our survey. And this is one thing that, kind of stood out to me is, yeah, we do really focus on the bad things. And a lot of those are more procedural in what we do to focus against the bad things. But there's an opportunity out there to actually focus on, the risk of positive things happening. But we have to have constructs in place to take advantage of that. Tim, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, there's a critical balance here, isn't there? I mean, as Rod says in the chat, following procedures, protecting the business is not optional. It clearly isn't. But on the other hand, it's one element, I guess, is what we're saying of what we need to do. It goes back to the point that I suppose that stuff on the left-hand side, well, that's what I expect you to be doing. But you want to distinguish yourself, what are you doing for me on the right-hand side? Many of our audience may be aware of the large-scale research that we did a couple of years ago now that looked at the behavioral attitudes of the procurement, legal, and in fact contract management community. We brought in some behavioral psychologists from UC Irvine to undertake a large scale. I think about 1,200 members participated in their experiment, and they found that the majority of our membership is what they termed preventist. We thought that maybe there was a discord here because there's good things on the right. If I'm an executive, if I'm leading the company, if I'm a CEO, I've got to be focused on that. I have to be optimistic about the future. yeah, we certainly hope we've got a touch of realism in our optimism that you don't get many pessimists getting to the CEO role. So often we take it as our role, if you like, to protect them from themselves, which is, which is legitimate. But at the same time, just being preventist isn't what's going to get us to the top table. It isn't going to get us brought in for those strategic discussions and meetings, because what they're focused on is where's the next opportunity, where's the growth coming from, not how do we make sure that the nuts and bolts are in place to protect reputation, etc. So it's a very fascinating balance, I think, that's brought up by this slide. I would also make the point that the research, as I said, showed that overwhelmingly this community tends to be somewhat preventist in its business behavior, but that's not true of everyone. And I think what we perhaps need to do as we build better performing procurement organizations is identify the personal characteristics of those perhaps who are preventist, which is a really important characteristic for a high proportion of the business activity, versus those that perhaps are more creative, more excited by opportunities from risk, etc. And we need to make sure that we're perhaps allocating people based on those personal characteristics, much more to the roles that then need to be performed.
Yeah, and I think you could say that we're creatures of this, right? We focus on the preventist. I like that. I wrote that down, Tim. I like that. Because I think we are preventists, right? Because that's what we get measured on. That's what we get audited on. That's what we get hit over the head on if it doesn't include those things. But how do we actually move from being a preventist to actually, let's say almost an opportunist, right? How do we turn that corner? And one of the things I focus on is the preventist things that we have focused on in the past. I think technology can help us greatly, and I mean, that's kind of what I've been developing since I've left BP, is how do we free up that time? And I think one of the key things to move from only focusing on the bad things to focusing on both of them is actually time to spend with the stakeholders, time to come up with these kind of innovative ideas for that category of spend, to take advantage of these things. I think time is the biggest thing that is a delineator for us. I guess is bring us to the next topic. In our survey, what if you had more time? What would you focus on? And this is an interesting one here. And I'd be interested to see, what we get in the chat. Because overwhelmingly, our respondents said if they had more time, they would deepen strategic relationships with suppliers. And so Tim and I were trying to kind of unpick, what this could mean, and what was the underlying, because maybe it doesn't have enough fidelity here to really dig into it. But it was kind of interesting that overwhelmingly, folks said that they would want to deepen their strategic relationships with suppliers. So Tim, maybe you want to share what was in your head when you saw this.
I mean, I think some really interesting points here. Focusing on requirement solution. Certainly for the higher visibility, more complicated areas of spend, we know that the number one downstream issue with value erosion, with subsequent supplier disagreement, etc., is because we were not clear enough about requirements, we were not clear enough about scope, etc., and that is becoming an increasing problem with the steady shift towards services. So, again, to the people in the chat pointed out, it depends. It depends on the duration of the agreement, for example. So I think we go back to better segmentation of what is the nature of the relationship that's needed. What are the levels and the forces for potential change, for volatility in that relationship. Improving supply chain visibility, going back to, I think, I don't think one area who made the comment about, I'm surprised that's not number one. Well, at least it is number three. And obviously that greater focus on supply chain visibility is absolutely critical. Probably a somewhat specialist field within the procurement function right now in terms of how do we structure relationships and build tools and systems where we can really get that greater transparency. And certainly we're seeing lots of member questions on that at the moment. Might be an area you want to comment on, Mike. But we did touch on the point that there's that first point is an interesting one. When people say deepening strategic relationships with suppliers, do they mean deepening relationships with their strategic suppliers, or do they mean looking at suppliers and identifying where a strategic relationship really might generate value? Because if they are, that of course starts to bring them much closer to those revenue growth and innovation goals potentially that the executives are saying are important.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of the big question. What do people really mean by that? Because if I were to look at that, I would say that I think we're in a period of disaggregation, not aggregation. But there are definitely techniques that you can use with strategic suppliers and tying their performance to to your company's performance as well. I know we've been successful in some of our account execs for suppliers actually having targets for our growth as well, and some of the places that I've worked in the past. So just really understanding that is important. And then we kind of asked the question in a little bit different way here, and you can kind of see the difference in what the stakeholders and practitioners are looking for, and understanding what's the benefit to the business if we spent more time on those activities. And you'll see the stakeholder, what was number one for improved supplier relationships for the practitioners in the last slide is kind of at the bottom for the stakeholders. So kind of, again, yet another large divide. But actually the practitioners, I think, nailed it and saying, if we spent more time, improved efficiency is the number one between stakeholders and practitioners. So I think, in that, I think that there's definitely alignment. But then we kind of get into the improved profitability and the stakeholders, and reduction in resources. And you quickly see, number two for practitioners is business risk, and then number three is improved supplier relationships. So there is a divide, and some of that I think is because some of the things we do provide is that business risk mitigation, probably in a preventive way, and that's how it's reflected here. But that is more like infrastructure, right? It's the lights. We expect the lights always to be on, and I think from a stakeholder perspective, as you look at that, they expect that to be on. That's infrastructure. That's what we expect from you. But that's kind of like doing your job. But these are the if we spent more time, these are the other things that they would expect that they would start to see. So I think that this is interesting, and that's why I kind of wanted to kind of focus on this a little bit, of this improved supplier relationships. Is this yet another area where there's probably a big divide on where the stakeholders really need us to be and where we think we need to be? Something that kind of, as we started off, kind of recenter yourself. What does that mean for your business? I can't, I'm not so myopic to think I would know the answer for all industries and businesses out there, but kind of take what you can from this information and apply it to your business and see how, as you recenter yourself, get focused on the delivering for the fourth quarter here. What do these numbers mean to you, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some things, of course, here where you could say it's lower down the stakeholder list because maybe they feel that their procurement organization is already doing a pretty good job on stuff like business risk mitigation. So it doesn't necessarily denote that they don't consider it important. It could just be, as I said, the question here is obviously, what's the benefit if we spend more time? On supplier relationships, I think that is an interesting one. But my observation there, Mike, is that Many procurement groups are still perhaps struggling to project themselves more effectively into that bigger role, particularly that post-award role. I think many executives probably would still take the view that supplier relationship management is something that the business does, not something that procurement does. We haven't perhaps made the business case for those who want to step more into that role and drive through that greater revenue contribution, greater growth. I think we've perhaps not made the business cases as effectively as we could and should. So that would, I think, be my observation on that one in particular. And as we said, this isn't necessarily an indication of how well jobs are done. I mean, again, the fact that procurement practitioners put business risk mitigation right up at the top is, once again, perhaps their realization of just how creaky some of their existing systems are and how limited their visibility is, that they're doing a pretty good job of protecting the business, but gosh, they're worried about how effective that can continue to be in such volatile market conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I love a good analogy, Tim. And one of the things I just popped into my head was, you talked about, SRM and that being done in the business. Well, I mean, I think we have to break out of that. That's done here. That's somebody else's job. This is my job. And I think one of the analogies that just kind of popped into my head was, and what I always told folks when in my team was, do you want to be a drive-through window operator, right? Or do you want to be very transactional? It's, I need this, and it's real no specification, no real care. The generic thing gets kind of handed to you. What's the value you perceive in the way that that service was delivered to you, versus, let's say you went to a restaurant and you could see into the kitchen, you could see the chef building everything, and as you ordered something, you could see it being prepared. The value of that is much higher, and the perception of what's being done is much higher than if it's just purely transactional. And I think we have to kind of make that step and have those touch points instead of waiting for people to come through us through the drive-through window. We actually have to open the doors, open the kitchen, so they can see, what we're cooking, how we're cooking it, and that transparency and that intimacy basically is build that, rather than just being transactional. If people want to know, how do you get to that next level, or how do you actually get to that point where you can add value, is I think you have to kind of take down those walls. And for us, those walls are often our processes. I think there's some things about Lean Six Sigma and those types of things. I would say with technology, we need to almost be able to throw away our processes as they exist today, and rethink them. What things do we still need to do? What things can technology do? Do we change the order of how we do them? Do we do things that we used to do serially? Do we now do them in parallel? I think you almost have to divorce yourself from what we've done in the past. Look at technology and what has changed in the last, I would say the last 5 years has dramatically changed the way and impact. And if we haven't revisited some of those things, we should look at that. But I think you have to be able to say goodbye to what you've done, in the past, and be able to actually reimagine, and to be able to move forward, because technology and the world is moving so fast, as we've seen in the last 18 months. So maybe we can move on to the next item. So I'll give just maybe a little bit of time for you guys to read these things. But one of the things that, in reading, in the survey where we asked folks to kind of write in some of their feelings, there was an overwhelmingly negative, tone to the responses, and some of these ring true. but I think it, as as Tim had mentioned, it's a time to kind of recenter, right? And I think, how do you turn some of these negative things into positive, positive things? How do we take on some of this feedback and spin that so that we can actually have a positive impact on the business? And hopefully, can we have this survey next year, and we actually will have, maybe could we have more positive impact? So I think a lot of these is our ability to actually get outside and work with the business. Procurement is treated like a piece of furniture. I mean that's interesting. I hope it was maybe like a high-end furniture, but the things about stakeholders not valuing strategic and advisory support. I think you have to show them that you're interested in their business and they'll be interested in yours. That's where I've been successful. I think you have to spend the time, and you have to kind of take down some of those barriers. If your only interaction with your stakeholders is following the process, these comments I think will continue to be negative. But it's only those, it's a small pivot, right? From being negative to getting positive outcomes. I don't think it doesn't take massive overhauling to change some of these things. It's just like small, it takes small changes to turn this massive ship. I always said that at BP, every day, I saw so much that I wanted to change. Yet, I couldn't be done in a day. As aggressive as I am, as fast as I wanted to do it, I wanted that boat to change direction immediately. But as you look at over time, you can see that incremental change. And you could see during the time that I was there that we had really significantly moved that massive ship. So I think it's those small changes. And if you can make a small bit of impact every day, I think you're gonna change your outlook. You're gonna change their perception. But I think you have to be able to look internally at yourself and to make some of those things and exploit some of the technology that's out there. I mean, one of the things that really got under my skin was being told that I was a barrier to innovation. I'll be open and share that with you. And that's something that drove us to create ContractAI, where now we're creating what was taking 3 to 6 months to get contracts completed. We're doing them on average in a week now. So what is it that's going to make you change, right? Just to say, all right, that's just unacceptable to me. We need to approach this from a different way. And I think now that we're seeing some tools out there that actually can help you do that. So Tim, I don't know, I probably spoke a little bit too much there, but maybe I'll turn that over to you.
No, I think some important points there. But I fully believe that the opportunity for fundamentally changing the environment has arisen because we have, pretty much coincident with COVID, interestingly, we have seen this massive improvement in the technologies we have available to us. And we absolutely must not forget that. And we've seen the leaders really taking advantage of that and really pushing ahead with a lot of the technology deployments, particularly in terms of things like artificial intelligence, but also, of course, with greater levels of digitization and particularly simplification and integration across systems to support much better data flows. On this slide particularly, quick comment, I think this is very, very typical of groups talking at each other, not with each other. I think it reflects a lot of the defensive behaviors we often see. So what would I be doing if I were leading a function like, a procurement group today? Well, actually what I tended to do in the past, I would be out there having different conversations. I want to shock my stakeholders with the conversation I have. I want them to sit up in their seat and pay attention, not just have this normal backwards and forwards about am I doing enough and what, blah, blah, blah. One of the approaches I took was I would go in heads of business units and I would say, okay, our strategy for next year, I want to make you, as far as possible, self-sufficient. So do you want to have that conversation? Oh, sorry, did I hear you right? You're actually wanting to make me more self-sufficient rather than try and control me more? Well, that wasn't sitting up for the first place. We engaged in that conversation, and for the first time, they really began to appreciate the nature of what we were in fact doing for them and what they were going to have to do themselves if they wanted to take greater control. If they wanted that greater control, I was very happy to equip them to do it, because actually a lot of what we would have been moving would have been busy work, and it would have freed us up to do a lot more valuable stuff. But just having that conversation not only changed the balance, but changed the perception dramatically. And we saw a real surge of business unit behavior changing because they began to view us as an ally, not as this obstacle or this control point.
I think that's inspirational, Tim. Thanks for that. So, kind of coming up to this next poll here, how advanced is technology in your organization? Or is it Flintstones, Jetsons, or Star Trek?
Yeah, it is a fascinating question. And I think, you know, of course, as we just touched on, Mike, there are several aspects to this. It's partly what is the nature and the capability of the technology you've got, but it's also this question increasingly, I think, of how fragmented is your technology. You know, you can have applications at a functional level, which can be some of the world leaders, but if they're not actually connected, you know, procurement and good relationship management with suppliers and so on really does depend upon much better data management across life cycles. And that's, I think, where so many organizations are struggling. Probably matters much less down at the commodity end of the business, but as you go up the spectrum of strategic importance of the relationship, that fragmentation of data is one of the biggest inhibitors we see at the moment. Not too many people in Star Trek, hey?
Well, it's good to see some people right there, right? That gives us hope, right? That we can get there. But I think this is pretty reflective of where I think we are. I think where folks are exploring, folks are experimenting, and I think that's wonderful. And I think sharing how folks can get from Flintstones to Jetsons, and that Jetsons to Star Trek, could be a great conversation that we can have in the future. I think the key to really getting there is actually leveraging the technology, using those intelligent systems. I'm a big fan of an ecosystem of best of breed rather than a one feature rich jack of all trades, master of none. I think if I were to share something, I think it's in my experience, I think it's looking at kind of an ecosystem of best of breed is how you will get there, because it will take way too long for one product to get you end to end and to that Star Trek level, if that's where you want to get to. Procurement really.
So some really important points here. I mean, we are seeing this trend towards dynamic clause libraries, automated fallbacks, much stronger on the sales contracting side, Mike, at the moment than procurement. In our benchmark study, which is imminent release, about 12% of sales contracting organizations actually say they're now at that position of the dynamic clause library with automated fallbacks. Much lower percentage, I think only about 6% on procurement. And we don't see right now, in general, that same close working relationship between procurement and legal as you perhaps get between sales and legal. Much more focus in most legal departments on revenue growth. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from sales. So I'm afraid the sad reality is here that legal is often a bit of a problem to procurement groups. It fobs us off with standard rigid templates. It gives very little authority for meaningful negotiation, etc. And of course, that adds very often to cycle times, it adds to the workload, it is damaging to the supplier relationship. So I think one of the critical messages to me out of this is procurement needs to get more vocal. Procurement has to have more confidence in making challenge. Don't sit back and accept the status quo. If we want to be strategic, we have to make a noise.
No, I think that's true. You know, and where I've seen successes where procurement and legal can actually, you know, work together. You know, this technology that's out there needs buy-in from both in most cases for it to be successful. So it's a journey, I think, that is more, you know, tied together at the hip than, you know, legal finding their tools that they want to use and imposing them on procurement, and procurement finding their tools and trying to impose them on legal. That's kind of what I see going out there right now, going on in the market. And all that does is add more time, adds more cost. And actually, at the end of the day, you end up with a lot of shelfware. So I think that journey, if I were to give any advice, that journey needs to be kind of together. You need to go find and have those requirements as you look for things and look at them together. I see a closer tie between procurement and legal in the future, especially as technology evolves. And I think where I see folks being successful is where, and actually making change faster, is where procurement and legal make these decisions together.
Yep. Yep.
I think we have one last slide, Tim, or maybe we missed it. But we can go on to questions from here. There's quite a bit of interaction. Anything that you saw that stood out that you want to address, Tim?
Well, I think the audience today has been great with all of the chat that's been going on. And of course, it's given us an opportunity to address a whole series of incremental topics that we otherwise probably wouldn't have had time to deal with. So I don't see too many. We've got from Talib, came in quite early. How do we identify inherent risks associated with supplier and draft applicable controls? And I would suggest, well, controls often within the contracts, of course, to mitigate those risks. Is category management enough, really, in your experience, Mike?
I think category management can be enough if it's actually done right. And what I find most often is category management doesn't spend the time actually to learn the category, or is allotted that time to really dig deep into it, to build those really interesting constructs that drive the business. It's more like single points of contact. So when category management can grow, you know, or invest enough time to become not a single point of contact, but actually a value driver to that business, that's when category management can be really, really helpful and really valuable.
And we are seeing much more focus, I think, going back to one of the chat points, we are seeing much more focus now on thinking about risk more holistically, not only as your slide illustrated it, we've got to think about risk not only in terms of bad things happening, but also of good things not happening. But over and above that, of course, the extent to which the pandemic has shown us that many of the risks are hidden because they're somewhere deep down in a supply chain. So, you know, one of the big topics, obviously, that has come through is how do we start to drive greater transparency and visibility? And how does that perhaps affect the relationship we need with our key suppliers, but perhaps also some of the contractual obligations from those suppliers in terms of feeding us with better data so that we can be more confident about whether or not our supply chain is resilient and robust.
Absolutely. And I guess we can close on that note. Tim, thank you so much for presenting with me today. I always enjoy our conversations. It's always the highlight of my day when we're able to. And everyone here, I want to thank everybody for attending and the robust questions in the chat. Made it really easy for Tim and I. Enjoy the rest of the week, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.